All right. Um, so today we're going to talk about how to write an op-ed, and we'll talk about a number of different things. We're going to talk about the structure of an op-ed because they tend to follow a pretty formulaic structure. We're going to talk about writing a strong lead, which is that opening paragraph, the thing that's going to hook your reader, get them to pay attention to your point, make it so they don't stop reading. And we're going to do a short in-class writing exercise around writing a powerful lead. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about the process of reaching out to editors. And I have a link for you that links out to newspapers all around the country and has the specifications of what they're looking for in terms of op-ed length, and also gives you email addresses for the editors that you're going to want to reach out to in terms of placing your opinion piece. So that's kind of three main things in today's class. And right in the middle, we'll have a short writing exercise, which I find is kind of fun. Thing that I want to say is that often opinion pieces are tied to news events. What I want you to encourage you to think about is that your community does not need to be flooding for you to write an op-ed about flooding in your community. One thing that I've done as a writer is that I've written op-eds about flooding, the increase in flooding, the increase in storms that we're having in this country, the strengthening of hurricanes. And I will have one written, and then when the first hurricane of hurricane season hits and it's all over the newspaper that the Gulf Coast is underwater again, or Florida's underwater again, or the Carolinas are underwater again, if you're on the coast, no matter if you're in California or Maine, you can send an op-ed to your newspaper that links your flooding experience to the flooding that's being experienced in wherever that hurricane is hitting. The same is true if you're experiencing river flooding, though we all know that river flooding is a little bit less likely to make the news. Certainly not as often does it make the national news. But that's one thing to think about. You know, I would encourage you to, after today's class, start drafting your op-ed, and then you wait for a news event to tie it to. That way, because a lot of times newspapers want to run op-eds really in close temporal succession to the event that's happening. So if you can send that op-ed in, you know, the day that the hurricane lands, you'll have a better chance of getting it published. There's really this drive to tie newspaper content to the 24-hour news cycle. So you want to make sure that I would have it on the back burner, and then when you have a flooding event, be it in your community or elsewhere in the country, you send it in. So that's the first thing that that's sort of what I wanted to start by saying. I'm going to now share my screen, and I have three different sort of handouts for the three different parts of the class. We're going to talk about structure, intimate details, and placing, pitching the op-ed. I'll share those with Harriet, and she can share those with you. I looked at trying to share them through the chat function. I can do that, but it's complicated. So I think maybe it's easier if I just send them to Harriet and she can send them to you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. And you should be able to see, let's see. I want to take this off. This is sort of the general structure of an opinion piece. I'm going to talk through this quickly, and then we'll get to the fun stuff, the practice writing the lead and whatnot. So an op-ed, I would say, often is 6 paragraphs long, 7. They're not incredibly long. And they tend to follow a certain structure. So each of these red sections is often a new paragraph in the op-ed. Sometimes you confuse the thesis and the argument. I'm even going to do that right now. Let's say it looks kind of like this. So the first paragraph in an op-ed is called, in newspaper terms, the lead. I think of this as a personal anecdote. It's where you emotionally hook your readers and make them care about the topic that you're going to talk about. You make them care about flooding in your community. And as an op-ed writer, you need to come across as an expert in the issue that you're writing about. Many of you, because you live in frontline communities, your expertise is born of experience, that you have experienced flooding again and again. You know what it's like to live with this problem. So in this opening paragraph, you're going to want to tell a story, probably of a time when you flooded in your life. And we're going to talk about what kind of details you can include in that story in order to make it really touch your reader, really grab the reader. That's kind of the bulk of what we're going to talk about in today's workshop, because I think as frontline people living in the front lines of flooding, those experiences that you have are the thing that makes your voice important to listen to. And that's what you're adding to the conversation. So that first paragraph is really crucial. You're going to use an experience in your life to talk about flooding and its impact on you. And then the second paragraph, this is sometimes called the nut paragraph. This is where you make your argument. Because I've flooded 3 times in 3 years, I think that it makes sense that no one should live here anymore. I think the city should buy my property and help us move. Or because I flooded 3 times in 3 years, I think the city needs to pursue putting in wider storm drains. Or you build from that experience, then make an argument. And you can, if you want, at that point, incorporate a little bit of outside research. You could reach out to Harriet. She would probably have some good resources for you to pull from in terms of thinking about $1 in adaptation today saves us $6 in the future in terms of storm recovery. Or, once a house loses, has 3 floods, it loses a certain percentage of its value, and it's cheaper to buy it out than to keep rebuilding. She can connect you with some good, generalized, bigger, factual information to support your thesis or your argument. And then we move into, so now we've got paragraph 1, it's that storytelling, it's the way you capture the reader. Then you get to paragraph 2, your argument, what you're asking for, what you'd like to bring into the public mind, the public conversation, how to move this problem forward. And then think of paragraph 3 and 4 as why. Why is this necessary to do? I'm going to put why here. Why is this necessary, needed? And what benefits can it produce? I would say, here's also where you can think about policy if you're aware of certain policies that shape your lived experience in your community. I know that I don't think we have any of the Residents Against Flooding in Houston on the call, but one thing that I always think about is, they talk a lot about how there are particular zoning laws that make it cheap and affordable for big corporations to buy wetlands and then turn them into big strip malls. Gabriella, this would also be relevant to you. So you can, at this, in these, you kind of have captured your readers, you've made your argument, and now you can get a little into the nitty-gritty details. This policy puts us at risk. And here's why. You can also think about this being a space, especially if you live in a coastal community, to bring in climate change. I might consider that in the second point section. You know, this is a problem that we face today, but it's also not going to get better in the future. It's going to get worse because of climate change. So we have to come up with just ways to address it today.
Might be worth me just mentioning here that we have our policy manifesto, our flood survivors manifesto, which has a lot of the requests. We also have more recently just some of the sort of 5 key demands that were used for lobbying days for those of you who have met with your members of Congress. So that gives specific, it gives both, so those 2 documents both give some data and research evidence and some demands if they're helpful for you.
Awesome, Harriet. Thank you. The third thing I want to say here is never be afraid to, if there's a sentence or 2 you can add into these paragraphs that have your first point, your second point in them, that are, never be afraid to add a little bit of personal experience back in. You can, drawing from that well of personal experience just makes your argument stronger. You definitely need the outside opinions and expertise and the facts and figures that Harriet can point you towards, but also you can always, if there's a moment where one of those facts or figures feels particularly relevant to you and how you've experienced flooding in your community, don't shy away from making that connection. Often the second to last paragraph of an op-ed is the to be sure paragraph. This is where you sort of preempt, you imagine what someone who's going to be critical of your lived experience or your opinion might say to you. And this is where you say, to be sure, and then fill in that imaginary criticism and then respond to it. So you're kind of getting ahead of the game. You're imagining what someone's going to say to shut you up, and you're going to say, I hear you, but, and then you're going to give them a counterpoint. This also makes your argument a little bit harder to dismiss. It means that you've thought about and addressed the counter argument. And that's something that will also help you get this placed in a newspaper. And then the final paragraph often loops back to that first anecdote, that first story that you told, and helps the reader maybe imagine it a little bit differently should the things that you argued for have come to pass. This is maybe where you imagine yourself into a future without flooding, and imagine what that would look like. You can also just come back to that lead and come back to the devastation of and the ongoing impact the flooding has had on your life, and talk about, again, why it's so important to address flooding today. So this is kind of, this is the general map of what an op-ed looks like. Do you have to stick to it perfectly? No. But this is for you to think about sort of what's at play when you write an op-ed, what kinds of things go into it. I'll share that with you so you don't lose track of it. And let me pause before we go kind of into the more fun. This is like the dry part, like, oh, there's a structure, here's the structure. Let's pause, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And if anybody has any questions on the structure part, this is a good time to ask them.
I just have a question about length.
Mm-hmm.
600, 800 words, is that mostly what people are publishing these days?
Yes, I would say 600, 800 words. Every newspaper, some newspapers have really specific requirements. Some say 450 words. Some will give you 1,000. That's rare. Let me see right now. Hold on one second. I'm going to share with you now this link to a ton of the different newspapers all around the country. And if they have specific word requirements, it's often included in the information that's in this link, if that makes sense. So this is probably, you know, the most important thing in today's class. You've got everything from the Chicago Tribune, Baltimore Sun, to the Arizona Republic and the Arizona Daily Star and the Arkansas Democratic Gazette and the Cincinnati Enquirer. So this is a link to a ton of different newspapers all around the country. And what you do is you click on the name of the newspaper, and then it'll open up into what they're looking for in terms of an op-ed and who to send that to. So the Miami Herald, email it to oped@miamiherald.com. Keep column under 650 words. Include headshot of the author. If 10 days pass, please send it elsewhere. Other structure questions?
You mentioned that you kind of could write the story and put it to one side until another flooding event occurs. So I'm in Florida, flooding happens in Boston. Is that a good enough link? How close does it have to be for it to seem relevant, or how do you link it?
So I would say if that Boston flood is making national news, yes, it's enough of a link. And section 2 of today's class will give you actually some specific language in terms of what's the sentence that you write in terms of linking your experience to a flood happening elsewhere.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, I mean, maybe it depends on the situation. What are your thoughts of writing an op-ed with one author or multiple authors? Is there a benefit to putting more than one person on an op-ed?
I mean, as a person who spends a lot of time writing, I like writing with multiple authors because, you know, maybe I do a draft and then I can't figure out how to solve a particular problem and I share it with my co-authors, and then I go eat lunch and I come back and the problem's solved. So I think there's actually something to be said about that collective sort of polishing of text that can make the process a little bit easier. Co-authors help you be like, oh, I forgot this thing, or you've been repetitive there, let's cut that out. So I think that there's a nice process based benefit. If also I think it depends. The lead that I'm gonna give you in terms of making the piece seem more attractive to a newspaper, certainly having co-authors can help you check more of those expertise boxes, like, oh, there's 15 people who've experienced this. This deepens the relevancy, this deepens the argument that this is a voice that we should listen to because it's not just one person, it's many people. The lead I'm going to teach you to write, though, is very first person. And I think part of how you connect with imaginary readers is by talking about what you've lost to flooding. And I don't mean what you've lost as a group to flooding. I mean what you, Anna, have lost to flooding. So I think you trade in the emotional connection sometimes when you move out of the first person. We can sound a little bit, if you start to write in that, we demand this, we demand that, it can sound a little bit preachy. So there's benefits and drawbacks.
Presumably, I mean, people on this call have a dual roles because they are both, in many cases, directly, or not all cases, but in many cases, directly impacted by flooding themselves. But they're also community leaders who represent people who are impacted by flooding. So presumably they could write in either,
Yes.
you know, say, you know, I flooded and I represent a group of residents in the same situation.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about how to write that I flooded paragraph. I think if you're a community leader and you represent people who flooded, but you have not yourself flooded, it's easy to say, it reminds me of the time, let's call her Deborah. Deborah flooded and she came to me. I think it's still, there's a power in thinking about and writing from this like deeply grounded lived experience. But you don't have to have experienced it yourself. You would then talk about your relationship with someone who has flooded and lost X, Y, or Z to the floods. That's often the perspective that I write from. It reminded me of the time I sat in Peter's basement and he pulled out the old family photos that were all warped from having sat underwater for 2 days. So if there's not more questions on structure, we're going to start to talk about how to write that lead. Gabriella.
I wanted to know, once you've used that op-ed, you create a new one? Can you use it multiple times in different areas?
Oh, I wish we could use them again and again and again. Really,
Well, sometimes the issues don't change.
the issues don't change. You're going to want to, technically as a writer, you shouldn't, like I'm not allowed to publish the same thing multiple times. But what then the task becomes is really going back to the first one that you wrote and thinking about how can I change the details but make the same argument. So in some ways you already have the structure and you're going to want to sub in, you know, I lost my family photos were warped to I lost my, you know, my dog died in the flood. I'm just, you know, I'm just subbing one thing for another. You could say instead of right from you could say, I remember when Peter lost, and you could sub in those details. So in some ways it would be the same structure. So you don't have to really reconceive of it from the ground up, but with different language. It's also going to change, you know, what event you link it to. So if it's a hurricane, Dorian versus Hurricane Harvey, you could then sort of start to think about, you might also think about, oh, I argued for one policy change here. I'm going to argue for something different in this next iteration of the op-ed. I think it's partly about, what do they call that? Like yeah, essentially you've built the house, now just sub in different windows.
Thanks.
Any other structure questions? Okay, so I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, and this is my favorite part of what we're doing today, so I'm excited about it. And we're going to, are you seeing intimate details? Okay,
Yes.
great. So you want to open your op-ed with an anecdote that invites your readers to empathize with your situation. And you do that by telling a short story, either about a time in your life when you flooded, or when someone you knew flooded, or someone that you work with flooded. It's not enough to say simply like, Hurricane X reminds me of what I lost to Hurricane Y. You want to use descriptive writing to create a specific picture in your readers' minds that will help them understand who you are and what repeat flooding has taken from you. So I think, you know, well, let me take one, I'm going to pause for a sec. So you want to think about who you are and what you've lost to flooding. I'm going to write here an example sentence that can help you connect flooding that happens somewhere else to your own experience. So you might write something like, as Hurricane Greta washed ashore, I was reminded of the time, and then fill in the blank. That's, I mean, Harriet, that's sort of to answer your question. Is a flood that happens in Boston enough to link to Florida? Yes, if it's a national event. All you need to do is use a phrase like this, and you've made the link. You might also think about in the body paragraphs and the first point, second point paragraphs of the op-ed, you might say, you know, you might make another link to that current event and say, you know, as we watch, I don't know, FEMA release millions of dollars to help folks live in short-term homes after the flood. It helps, you know, I think about whether or not I could do that for the third time, whether I'd want to do that for the third time, whether there's not a better solution going forward. So you might, if you're playing this game of linking your op-ed to a national flood event, you might also then want to link some of the policy questions that are happening potentially around that flood to policies that are relevant to you in your neighborhood. So I'll leave this sentence up here. I want to get back to this point of your real task is not to put in like, oh, I lost my house to a flood. Your real task is not to say the biggest thing you've lost to a flood. Your real task is to help your reader understand how flooding has impacted you, Virginia, or you, Harriet, or you, Anna. And losing a house is something that anyone who's never experienced a flood can conjure up. Like, oh, flooding, you probably, I don't know, lose your house or you lose your car. We want to include details in this opening paragraph that are things that someone who's never experienced a flood can't even possibly imagine. And in the intimacy of those details, they're going to feel like they're gaining insight into you and your experience. So intimate details are details that symbolize a memorable truth about a character or scene you're describing. And I contrast those in writing with something called a regular detail, a detail that's just something that engages with the five senses: sight, sound, touch, smell, or feel. So a regular detail might be like, her hair was brown. Including that brownness doesn't actually tell me anything about who that person is. I can't start to imagine them based on who they are. It's sort of like saying, oh, the walls in her house were painted, I don't know, light white, egg yolk yellow. Like, I really don't learn much about them from that detail. But if I were to say to you, for instance, describing Anna's home, the wall of her, I don't know if that's your dining room or your office, the wall of her dining room was plastered in over 36 photographs of, and I can't tell who those people are, but they're hung so tight on the wall you can't even see the wallpaper behind them, or you can't even see the wall behind them. That detail tells you that Anna is a person who derives a great sense of worth based on the people that are in her life. And that's a really different detail from, oh, her walls are painted white. So your task as you write this opening paragraph is to think about what are the things that I can describe, specific things that I can describe that I have lost to a flood that tell the reader something really special about who I am. That is so fundamentally different than I lost my house, I lost my car. And that's really, this is where the power of storytelling and the power of your experience can make a big big impact, especially in terms of just getting the piece placed, getting someone to pay attention. So let's see. These are, so you see my example, her hair was brown. We don't really know anything about her based on that. I have this other example, an intimate detail. Miley Cyrus blasted on her stereo. She was thinking about what a great idea it was to name her pet poodle or her pet frog after her favorite singer. I'm curious. I think that I imagine the person who's being described, if she has a poodle, she's one kind of person. If she has a pet frog, she's a different kind of person. I'm curious to your minds, what do you think we know? What can we assume about who this person is based on the details here? Miley Cyrus is also a detail. So I'm going to kind of kick it open to you. Who's this person? And I'm trying to make my screen so I can see more of you. There we go. Yeah, does someone want to hazard a guess? Who's this person?
Someone who loves animals.
Someone who loves animals. If she has a poodle, if she has a pet frog, who's this person?
She's an outdoor person, a nature lover.
She's an outdoor person, a
Unconventional.
nature lover,
Unconventional.
unconventional.
Love music.
She loves music. We know that from the Miley Cyrus.
She would have a wild spirit if she likes Miley Cyrus a little bit on the wild side.
Yeah, I think of like we know it's a woman. If a woman has a pet frog, some part of me thinks so. She's a tomboy. She doesn't mind like slimy stuff. That's me. I would have a pet frog. What about if this person who loves music has a pet poodle?
Do people still have poodles?
You know, my best friend has a poodle, and now I'm suddenly thinking, like, I don't know if the things I would assume about this person based on her poodle are true of my best friend, which is to say that you also have to be careful. Like, when you include an intimate detail, people make assumptions. If I put in a pet poodle in a story, if I see a pet poodle, well, tell me what you guys think when you read about a poodle. People do still have poodles.
But
Well,
she's feminine.
Yeah, feminine.
Yeah, I picture like a girly girl. But my best friend is not a girly girl, and she totally has a pet poodle. So, you know, I think there's something to be learned here also about sort of readers and stereotyping. Like, you include a detail and they're going to make assumptions about who you are based on that detail. And some of that you can control and some of that you can't. My friend's pet poodle is named Faust. So maybe if I included, oh, she had a pet poodle named Faust, I might start to think something slightly different than if she had a pet poodle with a pink ribbon on her ears.
Big time.
Every little detail tweaks your reader, touches your reader, gets them to imagine who you are. And you can deploy those details to get all different kinds of buy-in. If you're from a lower income community and you lose something that you can't afford to replace, including that information, you don't have to say, oh, I'm from a lower income community. You can say, I lost the laptop my sister gifted me and I couldn't replace it. And we get a sense of who you are and how flooding is impacting you from that little detail. You don't have to say, I'm from a lower income community. That detail does it, and it helps. Readers also get a lot of pleasure when they're being asked to engage imaginatively with something that's been written, when they're not just being told, oh, this is a low income community and we can't afford to just go out and buy new blah, 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 blah. if you include that intimate detail about the computer gifted to you by your sister that you can't replace, the reader does some of that work themselves, and they get pleasure in doing that work. They get drawn more deeply into the story. They're not being told, they're being shown and asked to then fill in some of the blank spots themselves. And that's I think where you get emotional buy-in from your reader. And those, again, these are the kind of details. You have a power to talk about policy changes. You have a power to talk about the things you want to change in your community. If you can include some of these details, you're more likely going to get your voice heard. And it's different than, it's different than a policy wonk or someone who knows these questions from an academic point of view writing the op-ed. So let's see, let's look at the time. Oh, we're doing good for time. So this is like, example 1 is about including details that can tell of objects, of things in your life that can tell your reader a little bit about who you are. Example 2 is about describing flooding in a way that's surprising or unexpected or not cliche. Describing the outside world in a way that, again, gives your readers insight into who you are and how you feel, and also sort of surprises them into paying attention by not just relying on sort of a cliched description of flooding. So it's about sort of looking outward and thinking about what intimate details can I include when I look outward. So a regular detail, it was sunny, or it was raining, or the sky was dark. These are kind of standard ways of describing. I should probably change this. I use the it was sunny in my normal creative writing class. Let's use it was raining. Because that's, a external descriptor that we might use to describe a standard flooding kind of day. An intimate detail, a way of doing that descriptive work, but with more specific language, is the air was heavy with a night storm coming in. There was always a storm coming in. What do we learn about the person doing the describing in the second example? Let's assume that we can't really learn anything about the person doing the describing in the first example. What do we learn about the person doing the describing in the second example?
I would say that they're weary.
They're weary. They've been through this before.
They're a deep thinker. Just the words.
Yeah, I mean, I partly lifted it from a Maggie Nelson essay. She's definitely a deep thinker, so you're spot on. Any other assumptions that you might make? For me, that inclusion of there was always a storm coming in. This is a person who is weary, who's vulnerable, who lives with repeat flooding. This is not someone for whom this is a one-off, right? And if this is you, you are welcome to steal that line, tweak it a little bit, use it in your op-ed. There's a saying, what is it? Bad writers borrow, great writers steal. So, if some part of this speaks to you, take it from my presentation, put it in your own opening paragraph, use it as your own, tweak it. The air was heavy with, I don't know, lavender and a night storm coming in. You could include the smell of a flowering plant from your neighborhood, that whenever you're going outside to check on the weather, you smell that plant Include that little detail in there. We then know that this is someone who pays attention to that, who's moved to notice the night blooming jasmine in their neighbor's fence. You know, the air was heavy with honeysuckle on the rusted fence of my next door neighbor, and a night storm was coming in. There was always a night storm coming in. So I want to pause. I've been chatting a lot and talking at you a lot. What I'd like to do is let's take like 5 minutes, and I want you guys to write a couple sentences that zoom in on an object or objects that you lost in one of the floods you've experienced, or that you know someone else has lost in a flood that they've experienced. The sentence might start, and this is again thinking about how you tie this, your flooding to a flood somewhere else. Watching Hurricane Greta make landfall brings up memories of the morning after Hurricane Irene, how I dragged out to the sidewalk, and you might then fill in the blank. What are some of the things that you lost that you carried out of your house and dumped on the sidewalk in front of it for the trash man to come pick up? My introductory, sentence here, you can use that. You can start, you can use it as a starting point, but you don't have to. So what I'm really asking you to do is think about how to describe your flooding in a way that gives your reader insight into who you are and how flooding has impacted you. Does that make sense? Is everyone kind of on board with me? I want you to leave this workshop with a little bit of the work of the writing this opening under your belt, so you feel less I know that it's a big thing to ask to some. If you don't write a lot, simply sitting down to write anything is a big shift in how you're going to inhabit the world. And I know this might seem like a big lift. So I want us to practice. This is a free space to practice doing a little bit of that writing together. So let's take 5 minutes, and everyone can experiment writing a sentence or two about what flooding has taken from them, or what they've seen flooding take from someone else close to them or not that they represent. And then we'll come back together, and if you want, you can share your sentences, but you don't have to. I'll give you a few seconds to wrap up, and I'll ask if there's anyone who wants to share what they wrote. And what I'd like to do, if someone wants to share, is that after they share what they wrote, I want us to say to the person some of the assumptions we make about who they are based on the details that they've included. And think of this as an opportunity. If what you hear back in terms of what you've written is not what you want your readers to assume, then it's a good opportunity to also think about, okay, what details should I tweak to maybe make them jump to a different set of assumptions about who I am? Yeah, does anybody want to volunteer? I see, for some reason my display isn't, there we go. Thanks for raising a hand. I am not seeing anybody's names on my display anymore. Maybe I need to screen share. Hold on. Virginia, go ahead.
Okay, I can share mine.
Great.
It might be too long, but
Go for it.
seeing the walls of flooded debris that lined the streets of Ocracoke took me back to the day I stood in the middle of my own street and snapped a photo of the walls of my flooded life along Old Forge Road. The sofa we bought when we first were married, the 8-track stereo cabinet my deceased grandparents gave to me. I can't continue. I'm sorry. Sorry.
I've got goosebumps. You did it, Virginia.
Sorry. Very
That's it.
Yeah.
You did it.
Brilliant.
You got us all to buy in 2 sentences.
Okay.
Yeah. There's something so specific in the detail of the gift that your grandparents gave you that you can't get back because they're
Right,
not
right.
with you anymore,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Sorry.
That's okay. No, I'm crying too.
That's right.
I think we all are.
Yeah. That's it. You that's it. You did it.
Yeah. Okay. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I didn't mean to cry. I didn't know it was
Don't
gonna-
worry.
I was gonna do that.
That's how powerful these intimate details are, right? And that's what you have as a flood survivor that no one else has, that you can use to get people to pay attention to you. Does anybody else want to share? Yeah, Susan.
I kind of put mine in the chat. It's just kind of the day I'm seeing. Can you imagine getting close to evacuation yet again? Didn't we do that a month or so back? Oh no, our kids are getting on the bus and crying because they don't know if they will have a home to come back to after school. As I sit and I watch the flag blowing so hard and the new buds off the trees hitting the windows, I wonder if I should go to the basement. This can't be happening. We're a Silver Jackets group. We were supposed to fix this.
So what stands out to folks as you listen to that? There's a lot of details in there. What are the ones that touch people the most? And what are some of the things that we think about who this person is that's telling us this story?
Desperation.
Right.
Worry about her kids.
Yeah, probably.
The worry about the kids, that for me
Remember when she was,
is to imagine kids that don't know if they're going to have a house to come back to. That to me was the thing that really touched me. And I hadn't ever, even in the position that I am in, that I listen to a lot of flood stories, I hadn't really thought of. I do want to make one note that is, I think, Susan, you also included, we're Silver Jackets group. I don't know what that means. I don't know if people in your neighborhood or who would read this newspaper know what that means. When you use these kinds of intimate details, you also, if it's a specific detail that not everyone kind of knows how to read, then you're going to want to make sure you explain it. So we're a Silver Jackets group. That means that I have no idea what a Silver Jackets group is.
It's a group that is led by FEMA, SEMA, the Corps of Engineers, the city, the state, everybody. And they were supposed to fix.
So maybe you can say, like, either we're a Silver Jackets group, we've worked with the state and the city for years to address this problem, but nothing has been done. Sometimes just the super intimate details need a little bit of help. You need to translate them a little bit for your reader. Don't include them. It's think about if the reader knows how to make sense of them. Yeah, Harriet.
I have a question about, so Susan started with a question, and I'm interested to know, is that as an opening statement, is that a good thing? Does it bring people in or not so much, or does it not matter? Or
how did you guys experience that? She opened with a question.
It was almost like she opened with a question and ended with an answer. We were supposed to fix this. And that would, talking about the yellow jacket, what was they, Silver Jackets? would it made me want to find out who the Silver Jackets were and why were they supposed to fix it. But that information wasn't left out, but I wonder if that information was somewhere else, that if it was researchable.
I think she opened worrying. I think she was worried.
I think she opened with worry. I think there's a little bit of, I'm realizing that I didn't talk about this, but you do sometimes want to be able to situate your reader. And I have a little bit of a hard time knowing where or what is happening with this opening question. Because if I'm just whatever, you know, whomever on the sidewalk who's picking up this newspaper, I don't actually know that this is a flood, right? At least not from that opening. I don't actually know that it's a flood. So maybe it's not a question, but I can't believe that we're getting close to flooding, evacuating because of flooding again. You want to make sure that your reader has a little bit of a sense of where they are. I don't think it's wrong to open with the question. I might start with a question more in the second paragraph and then answer it. It's a little bit hard to open an op-ed with a question. Like the first line. I think it's a great rhetorical technique, but you kind of want to situate the reader instead of being like, what's happening? But I like it. I would maybe do it for the second paragraph. I can't imagine that getting close to evacuation again. I want to make sure that we get through the final part of this class. So if people want to keep sharing their stories in the chat, that's awesome. Great idea. This detail, my son saved for 2 years to buy his car. It was a used silver Honda Accord. Awesome. I have a sense that that car is going to be ruined by the flood that's going to come. And I have I know who this person is. This is not just whatever car. This is a car that was saved for, scraped away for, meant something to the person who owned it. And it wasn't gifted. It wasn't a Lexus, its loss is significant. So, awesome details there. Everyone keep sharing in the chat, and I'm going to go back to my screen share to talk a little bit about how to get these pieces placed with the last 15 minutes that we have. So let me open up that document. And open the screen share. Okay. So, getting your story published in the newspaper is called pitching in the world of writers. And we're going to go over a little bit about how to do that today with the last 15 minutes that we have. How do you get someone to listen to your story now that you've put it down on paper? How do you establish credibility, capture interest, convey the immediate relevance of your point quickly and decisively? Pitching, which means simply reaching out to a newspaper and proposing that they publish your article, can happen in a number of different ways, but most often these days it's done via email. What you should know is that you don't want to write a 5-paragraph email pitching your story because no one wants to read a 5-paragraph email. You want your pitch email to be maybe 2 short paragraphs, and you attach to the pitch email a Word document with your op-ed. So the op-ed is like the long version. The pitch email is short and decisive, and it answers a couple questions. Why now? What's the news hook? Why is it worth reading this at this moment? That's where you say Hurricane Greta washed ashore in Boston last week, leaving 2 million people out of their homes. And it's important that we address large scale flooding here and around the country today. So what? Why should people care? That's, maybe this is maybe the so what, why should people care line. Maybe that's where you reach out to Harriet and you say, Harriet, could you give me a statistic around, I don't know, how many, what's the value of all the homes that are in the floodplain in the country? Or how much did FEMA spend last year on hurricanes? Or, there's a million different little stats that you could jump into the so what, why should people care to answer that question. And then why me? Why am I the best one to write this? My name's Elizabeth Rush. I've lived in Oak Bottom for 5 years. I've flooded 5 times since I moved here, and the problem's not getting better. So, you should do that in like 1 to 2 paragraphs. Again, it's short and to the point. And then you write a line that says, attached below, you'll find a draft of my op-ed. And include your contact information. So it should be timely, again, if you're tie it to flooding in your neighborhood, tie it to national flooding, tie it to a national conversation. If you see one happening around FEMA and setting aside money to rewrite flood maps, an op-ed has to be timely to get into the newspaper. It should be well written. One way to think about how to make sure your op-ed is well written is to get other people to read drafts of it before you send it to the newspaper. So that's, I think, one of the biggest myths about writing is that it's something that we do in isolation. All professional writers have people that they send their drafts to that read their drafts and help and go, hey, wait a second, I don't get this part. And then you go back to it and you revise it and then you send it to a different friend. And they go, hey, wait a second, I didn't get paragraph 3. Or they do what I just did with Susan. Hey, I don't know what a silver jacket is. Could you explain that for me? So I want to really encourage you before you send off your pitch email to the editor to share your op-ed with a couple people and then make revisions, and then share it with a couple more people and then make revisions and then send it to an editor. That revision process is key. Revision is 95% of my job. I sit my ass down in front of my computer every morning for 3 to 4 hours and I revise. I'm not writing most of the time. I'm working over what I've already written. It should be brief and clear. That, again, do not write a 5-paragraph pitch. Most newspaper editors are underpaid and don't have a lot of time. So make it short. And the unexpected point of view, that's what you guys have in spades.
What? Oh, good Lord.
Here's follow up. If the editors respond, thank them for responding. Even if they say no, write back and say thank you. You open up a door, and that door being open might eventually lead to a yes when you have another storm or another set of circumstances that demand a response from a flood survivor. If they publish it, say thank you for giving space to your ideas and issues. Timeline, if there's no response. What you need to know also, as we were talking about, op-eds really are newsy. They need to be tied to current news events. So send it to an editor at your local newspaper and then think about how long does this story have before it's expired and no one wants to run it. And think about, for instance, I had a piece that I wrote urging the governor to tie her to change her nomination for the public utilities chair. This is so like wonky. In Providence, in Rhode Island. I was like, I want her to, she had nominated someone to the public utilities chair that had a history in the fossil fuel industry. And I thought that that was inappropriate. And I wrote the Providence Journal and I asked them to run the op-ed, and I didn't hear from them for 2 days. And I knew the nomination was going to be over soon. So I said 2 days is enough. And I sent it to the Newport News, and the Newport News published it. So, you know, often with some of these flooding events, you probably have a week, 2 weeks before the newspaper is going to be running other stories. So think about what's your number one newspaper, send it to them. And if after a couple of days you don't hear from them, write a follow-up email that says you'd like to run the piece somewhere else, but since you'd like it to run in their newspaper, but since it's timely, if you don't hear from them by the end of the day, you're going to send it somewhere else. Or if you don't hear from them by the end of the week, you're going to send it somewhere else. So, and then submit it to the next newspaper. It's considered, it kind of breaks the rules to send it to 5 newspapers all at the same time. You want to send it to one editor, wait. If they say no, or if you don't hear from them, send it to another editor. So that's kind of like, there's these unwritten rules in terms of getting pieces published. And I sent you that link in the chat to a bunch of different newspapers all around the country with editors and the specific things they're looking for in terms of op-ed length. I'm gonna stop the screen share and just ask if there are any lingering questions. Yeah, and sending, Suzanne, excellent idea. Send your op-ed to other folks in higher ground. They're a great sounding board. They might say like, oh, but you could include this detail or this statistic. They know these issues really well, but also make sure you send it and share it with people who don't necessarily know flooding so well, to make sure that it's clear to someone outside of the problem as well. Anybody, any questions?
We've had several people who volunteered to just, you know, give feedback and respond to other people's op-eds. So if you want that, you know.
I'm going to resend this link because that's like one of the most important things about today's class, the link to all the other editors and newspapers around the country.
And just so that everyone knows, so I will ask Michelle after this call to get the training video, the recording of this up on YouTube. And so I'll send that out along with the documents, Elizabeth, that you're going to send me. And I'll also send it with the lobby day documents, just in case some of you haven't received them or want to be refreshed, because some of the many issues I know that you are all fighting, with a focus on the federal government, but it might have some content that you can pull out. And, you know, we're really keen to get you writing your stories, just like, you know, I think Alexis has managed to set up 16 or 17 meetings with your members of Congress. You know, the next thing to do is to get your issues out in your local papers. So we're really keen to help you in any way we can.
And also national newspapers. Gabriella, I know, got an op-ed in the New York Times. So also, I mean, that's just something to say, like, get it in the local newspaper and also get in the national newspaper.
Right. And if it's a national story, and if it clearly relates to the national story, and it's for a national publication, we also might be able to bring in the help of the Kresge grantee, Laurie Mazer. She's from Island Press, and she sometimes helps pitch national stories. So we've got 3 minutes left, and unless there's any remaining questions, I'll I really want to thank you both. I'm so grateful to you for your time. I've had some really nice personal Facebook messages just saying how thrilled people are and how helpful it is. And I think you've got us off on a roll. And for those of you who don't know, Elizabeth incredibly generously, she does a lot of speaking engagements across the country and donates a percentage of her speaking fees to Higher Grounds, and I have been able to help some of you as a result of her donations. So incredibly generous in many ways. Thank you so much.